Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 9 of our reading of Neptune 1 is Missing. It is a book by Hugh Walters, and we're going to go over the copyright information here. Let me find it in the book first. It says Neptune 1 is Missing, copyright 1969 by Hugh Walters, first American edition, all rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or parts of it in any form. So, anyways, let's go back and okay, in the last last part, the crew of Neptune 1 was able to contact control, and they found out that all the lateral rockets were basically busted. So they are basically in trouble. It looks like they're going to have to just complete the mission, and then you rebound off of Neptune's atmosphere or something, gravitational pull. Anyways, we are going to continue where we left off. Okay. Okay, well, we're going to talk a bit more about these lateral rockets. So we're going to go back a paragraph or two. One by one, they exposed the sad side of the ruined laterals. Each one, like the first, beyond repair with the resources they had. It was just as they'd looked at the 12th that the radio crackled. A voice warned that Sir George was about to speak. Had they not known him so well, Chris and the others would have thought that the director was unaffected by the news of their plight. But though he seemed to pass off the condition of the side rockets, he just bad news, quote unquote, they knew how he must be feeling. Then he went on to suggest a careful examination of the AHA. Was this just a ruse to find them something more to do? It probably was, but Chris led the way to the apparatus. First, they climbed up into the fridge, the quote-unquote fridge, above the cabin. An examination of all four speed special hypothermia couches revealed surprisingly little damage. Tony was able to say he could repair them fairly easily. Then they returned to the cabin to look at the programmer, the brains of the apparatus. Here was the real seed of the damage. As soon as they had removed the cover, the usual depressing sight of tangled and scorched wires met them. It's no use, sighed Maury. We could never sort that out in a lifetime. I'm not so sure, said Tony, who had been looking more closely at the rest. Two of the circuits are better than the others. It might just be possible to patch those up. What he meant was that of the four separate circuits controlling the four hypothermia couches, two could perhaps be made to work again. I'll report while you make a start, Chris said quietly. He was fully alive to the appalling situation that would arise if two hypothermia couches could work and two could not. How could one choose among these four close friends? Is it good news or bad news? Whiskers asked Sir George. He and Billy Gillianders, together with Dr. Rosenberg and Professor Boronoff, were with the director when a message was brought into the office where they were gathered. The loudspeaker, which would have brought Chris's voice to them, had been switched off, for they found it impossible to concentrate while waiting tensely for every word that came over the radio. At the moment, they needed their utmost power of concentration, for a fateful decision had to be made. Sir George Benson passed the message round silently. It was a typescript of Chris's report that, on a preliminary examination, it might be possible to restore two of the hypothermia couches to working order. The crew were starting on the task immediately. The men gathered in the director's office realized in a flash the full implication of Chris's words. It was bad enough having to decide on whether to subject the ship to the terrible hazards of completing its journey without the added complication that only two of the crew could survive it. Sir George Benson wasn't the only one to feel the agony of the moment. Even Professor Boronoff, a stolid Russian, was tormented by the decision that must be made. Everyone would agree that if it was possible to get only 2 astronauts back alive, they must do it. But which two? The professor, naturally, would have liked Serge, his compatriot, to have been one of the pair, but national identities were no longer important to a man's united effort were no longer important in man's united effort to conquer space. Time was when he would have insisted that the citizens of the Soviet Union should have been one of the fortunate couple. Now it mattered only that the decision must be in the best interest of the human race as a whole. Even as Whiskers and the scientists were realizing the full implications of the situation, the crew of Neptune 1 had started on their task. Fortunately, not only Tony, but Serge also understood the mechanism of the AHA. While Chris worked under Tony's direction, Maury put himself under Serge's orders. Between them, they stripped down the 4 circuits and exposed the full extent of the damage. Many hours passed before the job was done, but before they broke off to get some sleep, Chris was able to report to Control that it was possible to make some repairs. As he lay strapped to his couch, Chris, exhausted in body, found that his mind just wouldn't rest. He could, of course, have taken a sleeping pill, but he hated doing this, so he let his mind roam wherever it willed, for he'd often found that he got to sleep more quickly this way. However, his mind kept coming back to one subject. Who should survive if only 2 of the hypothermia couches could be made to work? With the problem still unresolved, he fell asleep. Chapter 13. When they had some sleep, the crew inspected the hypothermia couches again, and it was clear that Tony's first assessment was pretty accurate. Now that they had had time to examine closely each of the 4 sets of wiring, they could see how extensive the damage was, but Tony explained how 2 couches could be made operational by replacing damaged parts in one circuit with undamaged parts from another. Cannibalism was the term he used. By common consent, the quartet turned away from the hypothermia chamber when they had finished examination. They floated into their cabins and silently ate some food. Well, that's that, Maury said at last. We can't repair the couches. Correction, Tony insisted. We can repair 2. And the other 2 of them are... okay. We can repair 2, and the other 2 of them are hopeless. That's what I mean, Maury declared. It's useless if we can only half do the job. What good will 2 couches be? I thought there were 4 of us. Chris knew that he couldn't keep silent any longer. As leader of the crew, he must decide the action to be taken before any disagreement could break out. He knew what he wanted to do. We are going to get those 2 couches working, he declared grimly, and I don't want any argument about it. It wasn't very often that Chris used his authority as crew leader to enforce his will. Usually all that was necessary was to express an opinion. The crew were so accustomed to working together that usually they thought and acted as one man, and he knew precisely what his 3 companions were thinking now, yet he must insist that his decision prevailed. Maury, Tony, and Serge looked at Chris in astonishment. Could he really believe that 2 of them would be willing to survive if the other 2 couldn't? For that was plainly the situation. Whatever Control decided, as a long journey was involved, far too long to endure without the relief of hypothermia. If they repaired the 2 couches, 2 of them could be saved and 2 of them would die. Better not to do the repair at all. Why did Sir George want the couches repaired anyways? If Neptune 1 was doomed to go careening forever through space, why let 2 members of the crew live almost indefinitely? With energy from the almost inexhaustible atomic motor, the AHA could possibly function for centuries, but who would want to wake up eons later with nowhere to go and with one's friends just a cloud of dust floating over the cabin's atmosphere? Control calling Neptune 1, we are working on a flight program that will use the gravity of the planet to turn you back to an Earth trajectory. Send a detailed report of all stores. Over. So Control had decided there was a possibility of getting the ship back to Earth, or was the order just to keep up their spirits? This seemed unlikely, for the deception could be kept up only for a limited time, and Sir George must have known that they would see through it. Control must be working on a definite plan. So it was important to make up their minds what to do about the couches. I don't I don't know what they have in mind, Chris began, but there can only be one reason why Control wants to know about the AHA and a list of stores. Now, if I'm right, and they can get the ship back, two of us can use the couches and two can't. But let there be no mistake about it. If Neptune 1 can get back, two of us must get back with it. There was a silence in the cabin. Then Maury spoke. And the other two, he asked. For the first time in his life, or almost the first, Chris lost his temper with his three friends. What in blazes do you mean? He stormed. What does it matter which two get back? The important thing is that two of us should, if we can. Don't worry, I won't be one to use a couch. Maury's face flushed. You know darned well I wasn't thinking of myself, but if you're not going back, that solves it. Neither am I. Tony and Serge will make the journey. Not so fast, Serge said quietly. He was the least agitated of the four. As leader, it is your duty to return with your ship, Chris. I shall, of course, join Maury. Tony, surprisingly, said nothing. Let's get the couches working first. We can argue afterwards, Chris snapped. For a moment, he thought he was going to have a mutiny on his hands, but Tony broke the tension by quietly starting work. The others followed, and soon they were all busily occupied. While his three crewmen toiled on the AHA, Chris began to make an inventory of their remaining stores. Though he'd had to speak sharply to his friends, his heart warmed towards them. Both Serge and Maury would have known. Both Serge and Maury would, he knew, have given up a couch for him. Of course, he couldn't allow that, but he appreciated their friendship. It was strange that Tony had kept silent. We can do it, Sir George, Benson announced to his colleagues. He straightened up from bending over the table littered with a mass of papers. The final results had just come in from the computer, and a flight program had been worked out for the return of Neptune 1. How long will it take? Whiskers asked. He knew how much depended upon the answer. 241 days from now, Sir George replied briefly. It sounded a very long time. How long would food last aboard the distant ship? Certainly not 240 days, nor half of that time. Until the stock list had been received, the dietitians couldn't start to calculate the maximum time that life could be supported, unless all four of the hypothermia couches could work. Some of the crew must be sacrificed. Benson felt cold at the thought of who would have to make the decision. Well, they could always draw lots and decide who should live and who should die. The crew could do it themselves, or perhaps he'd do it for them. He wondered what they were thinking, so many millions of miles away, and what effect it would have upon them when it became quite clear that only two of them could be brought safely back home. Chris, as the leader of the crew, would be a most valuable member to get back alive. Perhaps he would be able to give a clue as to what went wrong. Tony, of course, would also know a great deal about the damage to the ship, but then so would Serge and Maury. It was going to be a ghastly job making a decision. Several times in the past, Sir George had to decide whether or not to risk the lives of the whole crew. Often he blamed himself for exposing them all to such frightful risks. But then they had all been involved. Now two only must be selected to live. The radio was at work. It was Chris's voice reciting in unemotional tones the sum total of the stores they had left. When he'd finished, there were some very grave faces in control. The dietitians shook their heads in dismay. Then they began to add up the calories to find how long on the most meager rations life could be supported. When they had completed their calculations, they handed over to the director the depressing results. There was barely enough food in Neptune wanted to keep one member of the crew alive for 200 days, or 2 days, oh, or two, or two of them for 100 days, and the journey for the pair who didn't have hypothermia would last 241 days. The repairs to the AHA and to the special couches was going well. Under Tony's overall direction, damaged parts were removed from two of the circuits. It so happened that the couches which could be repaired had carried Tony and Serge on the first part of the journey, but though each couch was built to suit each individual member of the crew, this meant nothing under the present circumstances. Because the couches belonged to Tony and Serge, this didn't mean that automatically these two would be the lucky ones, or did it? As they worked, Chris found the problem pressing on him more and more. In a few hours, the job would be done, and then the choice would have to be made. It would have been so much easier for him if 3 of the couches could have been made to work. There wouldn't be any problem then, he told himself. He wondered if either Maury or Serge had the same idea. From what they had said, he thought it very possible. He must be careful to see that they didn't forestall him. Tony was rather different. When Maury and Serge had offered to give up their claim to a couch, Tony had remained silent. Of course, he was the youngest, but in the past he'd been as courageous and self-sacrificing as any of them. Not that Chris could have accepted his offer, but it would have been good to hear that Tony hadn't lost his spirit. Perhaps all the hard work and the terrible uncertainty about the future were having their effect. What are you going to do? Whiskers asked Sir George. It was now plain that Neptune 1 could be brought back to Earth by completing its flight around the planet, but only 2 of the crew could have hypothermia. No matter how the rations for the other 2 were reduced, even if they stood the utter loneliness and mental stress of the journey, they would starve to death. I'm going to tell them frankly what the position is, Sir George said firmly. Then I shall ask them if they wish to decide for themselves who will survive, or if they wish me to do it. And if they want you to choose, then I'll do it, the director answered. Even the thought of this made him feel sick. Yet, if necessary, he would accept this crushing responsibility. Whiskers couldn't bring himself to press his old friend further. Sir George steeled himself for the task and asked for the microphone. Control calling Neptune 1, he said. So, we are going around Neptune after all, Tony remarked, after Sir George's voice had died away and the message had been formally acknowledged by Chris. At least some of us are. The others didn't answer him. Since Tony hadn't volunteered to be one of the casualties, they assumed that he felt he ought to be one of the 2 survivors. He might well have been so, but at least he should be prepared to take his chance. It was very unlike him to be unwilling, but perhaps his nerve was failing him now that death for 2 of them was inevitable. Meanwhile, Chris was thinking the situation over carefully. His mind was quite made up that he wouldn't be one of the survivors, no matter what arguments his friends used. Nothing would move him. At the right moment, he would bid them farewell and step through the airlock out into space, but who would accompany him? He guessed that both Maury and Serge would claim the right to make the sacrifice along with their leader. If Tony wanted to return to Earth, then the choice he'd have to make would be between the 2 volunteers, Maury or Serge. They would get the 2 couches operational first, and then the matter would be settled. So the work went on, and Tony noticed the coolness towards him. It didn't upset him, for inwardly he chuckled to himself. How much more work is there? Chris asked Tony coolly. About another 2 hours. Should see it through, Tony answered. And that's mainly soldering connections. I think that's pronounced soldering, actually. But it's spelled soldering. Soldering connections. Right. Then we'll turn in, Chris decided. He and his crew were very tired, but he really wanted an excuse to do some more thinking. It wasn't going to be easy, for both Maury and Serge would be valuable survivors. Both were equally close friends, but both had been through many dangers with him, and the bond among all three were equally strong. No, it wasn't going to be easy. He drifted off into an uneasy sleep. Chris awoke some 6 hours later. He remained still for a few minutes on his contour couch before attempting to release his straps. He could hear the regular breathing of his companions, one of whom he would soon have to condemn to death. The problem of who had still not been resolved, and he lay there turning it over in his mind. A vague uneasiness crept over Chris. Something was wrong, but he couldn't say what it was. The feeling had gradually made itself felt as he wrestled with his tremendous problem. And at last he had to pay attention to it. Loosening one of the straps, he heaved himself up on his couch and looked around the cabin. The light revealed Serge and Maury still asleep and breathing regularly, but Tony's couch was empty. So it must have been because he had become aware subconsciously of Tony's absence that he'd felt a little disquiet. No doubt Tony had waked up early. If he was so keen to get back to Earth, he'd probably resumed work on the hypo couches up above. But Chris couldn't hear him, and after a few seconds, he thought this strange. Without waking his two companions, he loosened the other straps and floated off his couch. A push propelled him towards toward the hatch into the hypothermia cabin. He eased himself through and looked around. No Tony. After a thorough search of the quote-unquote fridge, Chris went back into the main cabin and searched there too. Still no Tony. He must be somewhere among the fuel tanks, but why? Still reluctant to awaken Maury and Serge, Chris climbed through the opening that led down to the vast tanks of oxygen and hydrogen. It took him a full 10 minutes to squeeze all around the narrow corridor. At the end of he was convinced that Tony wasn't there either. Serge, Maury, Tony's missing, Chris called as he returned to the main cabin. The other two were soon awake, and Chris told them what had happened. Perhaps he's ill somewhere, Maury suggested. They made a thorough search of the ship. It was Chris himself who found the clue. He opened the locker where the spacesuits were stored. There was one missing, Tony's. Chapter 14. So after all, Tony hadn't selfishly wanted to get back to Earth. He deliberately waited until the repair job was nearly done. Then, without saying a word to anyone, he waited for them to fall asleep before putting on his spacesuit and slipping quietly through the airlock. Far from wanting to claim one of the two hypothermia couches in working order, he had deliberately sacrificed himself to make Chris's task easier. As his companions realized how much they had misjudged Tony, they felt very guilty. They didn't dare to mention this to each other, though they knew the others were feeling the same way. We've got to get him back, Chris said. I wonder how long he's been gone. No means of telling, mumbled Maury. And the radar isn't working, so we can't pick him up that way. He must be floating alongside the ship, Serge pointed out, unless he used his air gun to blast himself away. That's a possibility, agreed Chris. Though Tony's disappearance was what Chris himself planned to do, and though it had solved the leader's dilemma, he couldn't accept this easy way out. If only for his heroism, Tony must be brought back and given his chance. I'll go outside and see if he's nearby, Chris said thoughtfully. Maury and Serge exchanged a quick glance. It would be easy for Chris to follow Tony's example and leave them in sole possession of the ship. That would give them both a reasonable chance to get home alive. Perhaps that was what Chris intended. Oh, no, you don't, Maury said quickly. At least not alone. Serge and I will come too. In spite of their leader's orders, threats, entreaties, and promises, the two astronauts were adamant. If anyone went after Tony, they'd all go. You don't trust me, do you? Asked Chris. No, we don't, Serge and Maury answered in unison. Yet Chris couldn't find it in his heart to condemn them. He would have done exactly the same thing if their positions had been reversed. All right, he said at last. Let's go and look for him. Tony had closed the inner door of the airlock very quietly. He was sure he hadn't aroused any of his friends. Swiftly he opened the outer door and gazed into the black, star-spangled sky. The pain that filled his heart wasn't fear. He was sure it was grief at leaving his companions forever, even though he knew that what he was doing would let one of them live in his place. He pushed himself slightly away from the side of the ship as the airlock door swung to. He dropped his hand to his belt and realized he hadn't a jet gun. No matter. He would just drift slowly away from Neptune 1. Meanwhile, it would be a comfort to float effortlessly in its company. How long his oxygen supply would last, he had no idea. He would think about it. He'd try to empty his mind of all thought and wait for gentle oblivion to come creeping over him. This is probably a really good place to stop for now. Kind of a cliffhanger, but we've been reading Neptune Was Missing. It is a book by Hugh Walters. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, or if you want to join the Discord server, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.